In the year 1847, a team of laborers conducting renovations within a long-abandoned church in the town of Millfield, Ohio, made a startling discovery. Concealed directly beneath the ornately carved pulpit, they found a hidden compartment. This secret space had been sealed with an elaborate locking mechanism, a device so cleverly integrated into the pulpit's design that it had managed to evade discovery for generations. Inside this compartment rested a single object, a weathered, leather-bound journal. Its pages had yellowed significantly with the passage of time, yet they had been meticulously protected from the elements. Upon opening this journal, the workers found it contained records of deaths, a list of over 8,000 individual names. Every single entry was written in the same precise, unwavering handwriting, documenting the date of death, the location, the stated cause, and something more. Disturbingly, the pages also included notes on property values and detailed asset calculations. Beside this grim ledger were 15 carefully drawn maps. These maps depicted settlements spread across the states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and each one was marked with the same chilling phrase, "The Promised Land." The maps themselves were not simple sketches. They featured detailed topographical markings that clearly indicated swamp lands, floodplains, and other dangerous terrain features. Alongside these geographical details were annotations concerning seasonal disease patterns and, most horrifyingly, projected mortality rates. Before we proceed further into the story of the Westbrook family and their reign of terror across the Ohio frontier, we have a request. If you find yourself captivated by the process of uncovering the darkest secrets buried within American history, please consider subscribing to our channel. This space is designed exclusively for those possessing the courage to confront the disturbing truths that mainstream historians frequently overlook. Let us know in the comments section which state you are listening from today. It is possible you are geographically closer to one of the Westbrooks' so-called promised lands than you might have ever realized. Now, let us return to the terrifying beginning of this tale. The early years of the 1800s were defined by a period of intense religious fervor that swept across the American landscape. An event known as the Second Great Awakening moved through the newly formed United States, bringing with it enormous revival meetings, a powerful sense of spiritual renewal, and a wave of innovative religious movements. This religious revolution fundamentally transformed American society, and this was especially true on the frontier, where the general absence of established churches created exceptionally fertile ground for charismatic preachers and unconventional theologies. Joseph Harkins, the master carpenter who was personally overseeing the church renovation, would later testify that his hands trembled so violently upon reading the first few pages of the journal that he could barely manage to close the cover. He stated it was not merely a record of deaths. He explained this to the Cincinnati Enquirer in an interview conducted several months after the discovery. He described it as a business ledger. Human lives were being calculated strictly in terms of profit and loss. Local church officials immediately contacted the authorities, and Sheriff William Blackwood arrived on the scene to take official possession of the materials. Yet, by the very next morning, both the journal and the maps had mysteriously vanished from the locked cabinet inside the sheriff's own office. Just 3 days later, Sheriff Blackwood was discovered dead inside his home. His death was officially recorded as heart failure, though persistent rumors suggested his skin showed unusual discoloration, and his eyes remained fixed open in an expression of absolute, unadulterated terror. The deputy who discovered the body, a man named Thomas Reed, resigned from his position the following week and left the state of Ohio entirely. For the remainder of his life, He refused to discuss anything about what he had seen inside the sheriff's bedroom. For nearly 200 years, what has become known as the Westbrook family's Millfield mystery has persisted as one of America's most deeply disturbing religious conspiracies. It was a calculated scheme that claimed thousands of human lives through what might very well be the most sinister land speculation plot in the nation's history. The documents discovered on that day in 1847 provided the first comprehensive evidence of a conspiracy that had been whispered about for decades, a conspiracy that had never been fully proven until that precise moment. Before we continue to trace the story of the Westbrook family's reign of terror across the Ohio frontier, we would like to ask once more, if you enjoy delving into the darkest secrets of American history, please subscribe to our channel. This channel is exclusively for those brave enough to confront the disturbing truths that mainstream historians often choose to ignore. Let us know in the comments which state you are listening from. Perhaps you are closer to one of the Westbrooks' promised lands than you realize. Now, let us return to the horrifying beginning of this tale. The early 1800s were indeed a period of intense religious fervor across America. The Second Great Awakening swept through the newly formed United States, bringing with it massive revival meetings, a powerful wave of spiritual renewal, and an explosion of new religious movements. This religious revolution profoundly transformed American society, particularly on the frontier, where the absence of any established churches created incredibly fertile ground for charismatic preachers and innovative, often unorthodox, theologies. These camp meetings could draw thousands of individuals who would travel for days just to attend. Participants often described experiencing what they believed was direct divine intervention, exhibiting behaviors such as fainting, speaking in tongues, and receiving powerful visions that they claimed changed the entire course of their lives. Ohio, having achieved statehood in 1803, effectively represented the gateway to America's western frontier. It was a place where land was plentiful, official oversight was minimal, and ambitious men could completely reinvent themselves, operating far from the watchful eyes of established society. The state experienced truly explosive growth throughout this period. Its population skyrocketed from just 45,000 people in 1800 to well over 580,000 by the year 1820. This kind of rapid expansion created a chaotic environment where new settlements could appear seemingly overnight, and religious communities could establish themselves with very little scrutiny. Among the men drawn to this land of opportunity was Isaiah Westbrook, a failed merchant from Hartford, Connecticut, who arrived in Chillicothe, Ohio, in the spring of 1803. Unlike many settlers who arrived with dreams of farming or starting a trade, Isaiah came with something he considered far more valuable: a vision, or at least, that is what he claimed. Standing over 6 feet tall, with piercing blue eyes and a commanding presence that was enhanced by a full, yet meticulously groomed beard, Isaiah quickly established himself as a lay preacher. He began his work within established Methodist circuits, but gradually began forming his own independent congregation. He possessed a voice that contemporaries would later describe as thunder wrapped in velvet. It was powerful enough to reach the very back of any gathering, yet intimate enough to make each individual listener feel as if they were being personally addressed. "God has led me to this place," he told the small group that had gathered to hear him speak in the town square during that first summer, his voice carrying across the humid Ohio air. He proclaimed that God had shown him that this land, this Ohio country, was destined to be a new Jerusalem for his chosen people. He declared that the old churches of the East had grown corrupt and complacent. Within just a few months, His roadside sermons were drawing crowds from miles around. By the time winter arrived, a small but fiercely devoted congregation had formed around him, calling themselves the faithful of the new promise. Isaiah's personal theology was a carefully calculated blend of familiar Christian doctrine and innovative interpretations that strategically positioned him as a uniquely authoritative voice. He placed a heavy emphasis on direct divine revelation, the imminent establishment of sacred communities. Each brother played a distinct and carefully calculated role in their emerging enterprise. Isaiah, the eldest at 36 years of age when they arrived in Ohio, provided the charismatic leadership and the overarching theological framework. With his commanding presence and profoundly persuasive oratory, he became the public face of their entire movement. Daniel, the middle brother aged 33, possessed a scholarly demeanor and had studied briefly at Yale Divinity School before financial troubles forced his withdrawal. His role was to craft the complex theological justifications for their scheme, producing volumes of religious texts that lent an air of intellectual credibility to Isaiah's visions. Samuel, the youngest at 29, the Westbrook brothers established their first permanent church in Millfield in 1805. It was a modest wooden structure that nonetheless featured an unusually elevated pulpit with ornate carvings. This pulpit was crafted personally by Samuel, who had trained as a carpenter. Its considerable height was a deliberate design choice, placing Isaiah physically above his congregation in a powerful visual reinforcement of his claimed spiritual authority. The founding of this church coincided with what Isaiah announced as his most significant revelation to date. "God has shown me a vision," he declared to his congregation on a cold January morning, his breath visible in the unheated church. He told them there was a place not 30 miles from their current location that God had designated as a promised land for their people. He described it as a place of abundance where those faithful to their calling would prosper as never before. He announced that the Lord had guided his hand in securing this sacred ground for their community, so that they might establish a settlement that was pure in his sight. This first promised land was located near what is present-day Logan, Ohio. It was a marshy area within the Hocking River Valley that the Westbrooks had purchased for a fraction of its assessed value, primarily due to its well-known reputation for summer fevers. What Isaiah's followers did not know was that this particular parcel of land sat in one of the worst malaria zones in the entire Ohio Valley. This was a fact well documented by earlier settlers who had abandoned their own attempts to farm there after experiencing devastating losses. A farmer named James Harrington, who had briefly settled in the area 2 years earlier and lost 3 of his own children to disease, attempted to warn several families about the imminent danger. "That place is death in summer," he reportedly told Ezekiel Winters, one of Isaiah's most devoted followers, catching him after a service one Sunday. "When the heat comes, the fever follows. I lost 2 children there before I understood what was happening. No amount of clearing or drainage will fix that land. Something in the very air brings sickness." His earnest warnings went completely unheeded. Isaiah had prepared his followers for exactly this kind of skepticism, having already incorporated it into his theology. "There will be those who test your faith," he told his followers during a sermon that specifically addressed Harrington's warnings without ever naming him directly. He spoke of those who would fear the promised land because they lack the spiritual protection that comes only through absolute devotion. He warned that Satan would send his messengers to plant seeds of doubt in their hearts. He framed this as the ultimate test of their commitment. By March of 1805, 47 families, comprising 192 individuals, had sold their homes and businesses, pooling their resources to purchase parcels in the Westbrook's first promised land. The price, while seemingly reasonable on paper, actually represented a markup of over 500% from what the brothers had paid for the land just months earlier. Isaiah led them personally to the settlement site, helping to establish a temporary church and organizing the construction of simple cabins. He remained with them throughout the month of April, conducting daily services and overseeing the initial development of the community. The settlement took shape around a central meeting house, with family cabins arranged in concentric circles, a layout that Isaiah described as reflecting the divine order of heaven itself. Each morning began with communal prayer, and 3 times each week the entire settlement would gather for extended services where Isaiah expounded on his growing theology of divine selection and spiritual purification through hardship. Eden was not built without labor. He frequently reminded them as they struggled to clear the waterlogged land for planting. The promised land of our ancestors required 40 years of wandering to reach. Our testing may come in different forms, but our reward will be no less glorious. Then, as the month of May approached and the first mosquitoes began to appear in troubling numbers, Isaiah announced that he had received another revelation. God calls me to prepare the way for more of his chosen, he declared during an evening service, his voice solemn. I must return to Millfield to guide others to their salvation, that they too might join our holy enterprise. He departed the following morning, taking Daniel with him, who had been serving as the settlement's record keeper, and leaving Samuel behind to oversee the community's continued development. What happened next was documented by Elizabeth Winters, the wife of Ezekiel, whose personal diary remained hidden within the wall of their cabin until its accidental discovery in 1890. Her journal, now preserved at the Ohio Historical Society, provides the most comprehensive first-hand account of life inside that first Westbrook settlement. By June, the first cases of malaria began to appear, primarily among the children and the elderly. By mid-July, the settlement had been forced to establish its first cemetery. By the end of August, that cemetery contained 73 graves, buried little Sarah today. Elizabeth wrote on August 12, 1805, her handwriting growing increasingly unsteady as the entry progressed. That makes 17 graves in the burial ground since last week. The fever takes them so quickly now. Healthy at breakfast, delirious by supper, gone before the next dawn. Ezekiel insists this is a test of faith, but I cannot understand what God would want with so many innocent souls. I suggested returning to Millfield, but Ezekiel says Reverend Westbrook warned that those who abandon the promised land abandon their salvation. A diary entry from September 3 reveals a particularly troubling detail. Samuel Westbrook visits each new grave, writing in his book with such careful attention. You would think he was recording births rather than deaths. She continued, Samuel spends hours in his cabin with his ledgers. Through the window yesterday, I saw him making calculations after the Miller family was found dead in their home. 4 more souls for his books. There is something unnatural in his precision. No grief, only numbers. By October, more than half of the settlement's original population had perished. The survivors, physically weakened and financially impoverished, abandoned their claims and scattered. Many died during the journey to other settlements, their bodies later discovered by travelers along the crude roads leading away from the promised land. Those who did manage to reach established towns found themselves objects of both pity and suspicion, often viewed as victims of what many locals had come to consider a bizarre religious cult. Meanwhile, back in Millfield, Isaiah expressed profound sorrow at the tragedy, skillfully incorporating it into a series of powerful new sermons focused on faith being tested by adversity. Our brothers and sisters have been called to heaven before us." He preached to his growing congregation, his voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Their sacrifice has hallowed that ground and prepared the way for a new revelation. The Lord tests most severely those he loves most dearly." What none of his followers realized was that Isaiah had already directed Samuel to quietly reclaim ownership of all the abandoned properties through a network of legal proxies. By December of 1805, the Westbrooks had recovered virtually all of the land from their failed settlement, now at absolutely no cost to themselves, while simultaneously retaining all of the original purchase funds paid by the settlers. This same land would later be resold to timber speculators, once the region's deadly reputation for malaria had faded from public memory. This pattern would repeat itself over the next 3 decades with frightening precision. Between 1805 and 1840, the Westbrook brothers established 15 different promised land settlements across Ohio, Indiana, and eventually Illinois. Each one followed the same essential formula. Isaiah would announce a new divine revelation identifying a fresh sacred site. Daniel would produce elaborate theological justifications and help organize the faithful for relocation. Samuel would handle all the practical matters of land transactions and initial construction. The brothers refined their method with each successive iteration. Their later promised lands included not just malarial swamps, but also arid areas prone to catastrophic crop failure, flood zones that would reliably drown spring plantings, and heavily forested regions that required an impossible amount of labor to clear for any meaningful farming. In every single case, the land appeared promising to inexperienced eyes, but harbored fatal flaws that would have been obvious to any experienced settler. Their fourth settlement, established near present-day Moron, Ohio, in 1810, introduced a new and sinister element to their scheme. This particular location sat on a floodplain that appeared wonderfully fertile and well-watered during the dry autumn months when prospective settlers were first shown the property. What Isaiah described as God's blessing of abundant water was, in reality, a predictable seasonal flooding pattern that would inundate the entire settlement each spring, destroying crops, contaminating wells, and spreading waterborne diseases. Particularly ingenious was their seventh settlement, established in western Ohio in 1815. This location featured what appeared to be exceptionally fertile soil, dark and rich-looking. In reality, the soil contained a high clay content that retained water very poorly and formed a cement-like crust when dry, making successful agriculture nearly impossible. By the time the settlers discovered this harsh reality, winter had already set in, leaving them trapped in an unsustainable location until spring, by which time starvation and disease had claimed dozens of lives. What the Westbrooks perfected was a form of religious exploitation unprecedented in American history, wrote historian Margaret Sinclair in her 1998 analysis of the case. They deliberately selected lands that would produce maximum casualties within the first year of settlement, allowing them to reclaim and resell the properties multiple times to new groups of the faithful. Their scheme combined the worst elements of religious manipulation and predatory capitalism, weaponizing faith against the very people who embraced it most fervently. The second critical component of the Westbrook scheme emerged around 1810, when they began requiring all members of their movement to sign a covenant of faith. This document appeared to be a statement of spiritual commitment, but functioned in practice as a legal transfer of property rights. These covenants, drafted by Daniel with input from legal advisors the brothers quietly consulted in Cincinnati, stipulated that if a settler abandoned their land or died without direct heirs who were also members of the faith, their property would automatically revert to the church, which, legally speaking, meant the Westbrook brothers themselves. The covenant's language was masterfully crafted to conceal its true purpose beneath multiple layers of religious terminology. As Moses led his people through the wilderness toward lands flowing with milk and honey, so too do I commit my worldly possessions to the greater glory of our shared journey. Should the Lord call me to his side before my earthly work is complete, or should my faith falter, and I depart from our sacred community, I hereby consecrate my portion of the promised land to the continuing ministry of our church, that others might benefit from the blessings I have received. Court records from Franklin County, Ohio, show that between 1812 and 1815 alone, the Westbrooks reclaimed ownership of over 400 parcels of land through these covenant clauses, most following the deaths of entire families in their third promised land settlement. The value of these reclaimed properties, even at frontier prices, exceeded $50,000, an enormous sum for the period, equivalent to millions in today's currency. As you hear these disturbing details about how the Westbrooks manipulated religious devotion for massive profit, consider the profound psychology behind such a calculated deception. If this story is giving you chills, please share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our ongoing research into America's hidden horrors. And don't forget to subscribe. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the stories that mainstream historians often ignore. And the Westbrook conspiracy goes much deeper than most people realize. Let's continue our investigation into how these three brothers managed to maintain their deadly scheme for over 3 decades. By 1820, the Westbrooks had amassed considerable wealth. Isaiah, now styling himself Prophet Westbrook, had established a central church in Columbus, Ohio, that rivaled the grandeur of many East Coast cathedrals. The building, constructed of locally quarried limestone with impressive stained glass windows imported from Philadelphia, stood as a physical testament to the movement's success. Its most striking feature was a towering steeple visible from miles away, acting as a beacon drawing new converts to the Westbrooks' growing enterprise. Daniel had taken the title Apostle of the Scripture and maintained a complex theological framework that justified their increasingly elaborate demands on their followers. His prolific writings filled multiple volumes, creating a distinctive theology that combined elements of Methodism, Presbyterianism, and innovative doctrines uniquely suited to the brothers' purposes. His central theological innovation, the concept of progressive revelation, held that God continuously revealed new truths to selected prophets, primarily Isaiah, and that questioning these revelations constituted a form of spiritual rebellion equivalent to heresy. Samuel, the most private of the brothers, managed their extensive property holdings and financial affairs from a fortified estate outside Cincinnati. Unlike his more public brothers, Samuel cultivated a reclusive image, reinforcing the perception that he was engaged in deeply spiritual work requiring isolation. In reality, his estate functioned as the operational headquarters for their financial empire, with a small staff of clerks maintaining detailed records of properties, deaths, and profits. Their organization had evolved significantly from its humble beginnings. By 1825, the Westbrook Church claimed over 3,000 members across Ohio and neighboring states. Most of these adherents were not residents of the deadly promised land settlements, but rather conventional congregants who attended regular services and provided continuous financial support through tithes and donations. This broader membership base provided both legitimacy and a continuous stream of potential recruits for new settlements. The brothers had also developed a hierarchical structure that insulated them from direct involvement in the most controversial aspects of their operation. Elders and deacons, trusted lieutenants who had proven their loyalty, now handled many of the day-to-day responsibilities of settlement management and property transfers. This arrangement allowed the Westbrooks to maintain plausible deniability about the horrific conditions in the settlements while continuing to profit from their inevitable collapse. Their growing wealth enabled increasingly sophisticated methods of operation. Land purchases were now conducted through a network of shell companies and proxies, making it extremely difficult to trace property ownership back to the church itself. Settlement supplies were provided through church-owned businesses at significantly inflated prices, creating an additional revenue stream. Even burial services for the inevitable casualties were monetized through a church-controlled mortuary operation that charged grieving families for consecrated caskets and cemetery plots. The brothers might have continued their operations indefinitely had it not been for the arrival of a young woman named Martha Collins. In the spring of 1838, Martha, a 22-year-old from a respected Boston family, traveled to Columbus to visit her cousin, Emma, who had joined the Westbrook Church the previous year. The daughter of a prominent attorney with connections to Massachusetts political circles, Martha had received an education unusual for women of her era, including studies in accounting and property law under her father's direct guidance. Described in contemporary accounts as possessing a quiet determination and uncommon perceptiveness, Martha initially attended services out of politeness to her cousin, but quickly became concerned by what she witnessed. She noted significant discrepancies between the church's proclaimed values and its operational practices, particularly the lavish lifestyle enjoyed by the Westbrook brothers, in stark contrast to the austere conditions encouraged among their followers. Isaiah Westbrook is no ordinary preacher, she wrote to her father in April of 1838, in a letter preserved in the Collins family archives. He speaks with an authority that seems to bypass people's reason entirely. When he identifies families chosen for the next promised land settlement, they respond as if receiving the greatest of honors. Though I've noticed these selections often target those who have recently come into an inheritance or sold businesses for cash. Martha's letter continued with an observation that demonstrated her unusual perceptiveness. The most disturbing aspect is not the content of his sermons, but rather what happens in their aftermath. I have observed Samuel Westbrook, the brother who rarely preaches, engaged in quiet conversations with church elders immediately following the announcement of chosen families. These discussions have the character of business transactions rather than spiritual counseling. Martha's suspicions deepened when her cousin Emma was selected for the sacred honor of serving as a personal assistant to Daniel Westbrook. This position gave Emma, and by extension Martha, access to the private offices maintained by the brothers in Columbus. Martha leveraged this opportunity with remarkable strategic thinking, carefully crafting a persona of naive devotion that allowed her to move through the church's headquarters without arousing suspicion. What Martha discovered there would ultimately unravel the Westbrooks' empire. While organizing papers in Daniel's study one afternoon in early May, she came across a locked cabinet of unusual design. Emma, having been entrusted with keys as part of her duties, innocently provided access when Martha expressed curiosity about its contents. Inside, Martha found detailed maps of all 15 promised land settlements, complete with annotations documenting soil conditions, drainage problems, and disease patterns. Most disturbing were the meticulous records of deaths, thousands of names organized by settlement and year, with property values noted alongside each family. These documents revealed the full extent of the Westbrook scheme, including projections of expected mortality rates for each settlement location and cold calculations of anticipated property reclamation values. One particularly disturbing document outlined what was called the selection criteria for covenant families, a methodology for identifying prospective settlers with maximum financial assets and minimal extended family connections who might later make legal claims on their property. "I cannot express the horror I felt," Martha later wrote in a deposition given to Ohio state authorities. These were not records of tragic losses. They were inventory lists. Human lives reduced to financial calculations with projected mortality rates for each settlement. They knew. They had always known exactly what would happen to these people. The deaths that Isaiah proclaimed as divine tests were in fact carefully engineered outcomes designed to maximize property acquisition while minimizing legal complications. Martha's discovery coincided with the Westbrooks' preparations for their 16th settlement, potentially their most ambitious and deadly yet. Located in a remote area of southern Illinois, this new promised land sat in a region notorious for both malaria and violent conflicts with remaining Native American populations. Internal documents suggested the brothers anticipated a mortality rate exceeding 70% within the first 6 months. The Illinois settlement represented an evolution of their scheme. Documents in Daniel's cabinet revealed plans to extend their operations beyond the confines of their own church, with strategies for recruiting settlers from German and Scandinavian immigrant communities who would be less familiar with frontier conditions and American legal protections. The projected revenue from this single settlement exceeded $75,000, more than all their previous operations combined. Over the course of several weeks, Martha secretly copied key documents, including settlement maps and portions of the death records. Working late at night in her boarding house room, she meticulously reproduced the evidence, concealing these copies inside a hollowed-out Bible, an ironic hiding place for evidence of such profound religious exploitation. Her plan was to escape back to Boston with this evidence and alert federal authorities through her father's political connections. However, as the day of her departure approached, she noticed a distinct change in how she was treated within the church community. Church members who had previously been friendly became distant or overly interested in her activities. She observed unfamiliar men watching the boarding house where she stayed. "Emma tells me that Daniel has been asking unusual questions about my activities," she wrote in her final letter home, which was never sent but later discovered hidden in her Columbus boarding house. "Yesterday, Isaiah invited me to a private prayer meeting to discuss what he called concerns about my spiritual commitment. I declined, claiming illness. This morning, I noticed a man following me through the market. I fear they suspect something. If anything should happen to me, please know that the Westbrook brothers are not men of God, but merchants of death. Their promised lands are killing fields deliberately chosen for their deadly conditions." Martha's fears were justified. Unknown to her, a church member had observed her copying documents late one evening and reported this to Samuel Westbrook. The Westbrooks immediately launched a discreet investigation into this potential security breach, with Samuel personally traveling to Columbus from Cincinnati to manage the situation. Church records obtained decades later reveal an emergency meeting of the brothers and their inner circle on May 15, 1838, with the cryptic agenda item, addressing the Collins situation. On the evening of May 17, 1838, Martha attempted to board a stagecoach bound for Pittsburgh, the first leg of her journey home. She never made it. According to the stagecoach operator's log, a young woman matching Martha's description approached the station, but was intercepted by two men who escorted her away after a brief conversation. A witness later described seeing her enter a church carriage accompanied by a man believed to be Samuel Westbrook. She was never seen again. The official explanation provided by the Westbrook Church was that Martha had received a divine calling to join the advanced preparation team for the Illinois settlement. When her family in Boston made inquiries, they received letters supposedly written by Martha describing her spiritual journey and requesting no further contact with her former life. Handwriting experts would later confirm these letters were forgeries, likely written by Daniel Westbrook, whose scholarly background included training in document preparation. Martha's disappearance might have remained just another mystery had it not triggered a chain of events that would ultimately expose the Westbrooks' crimes. Her father, William Collins, a prominent Boston attorney with connections to Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster, refused to accept the church's explanation. He traveled to Columbus in July of 1838 and launched his own investigation, hiring local detectives and offering substantial rewards for information. Collins was not a man to be underestimated. His legal practice had handled several high-profile cases in Massachusetts, and he approached his daughter's disappearance with the same methodical determination that had made him successful in the courtroom. He established a base of operations in Columbus and began systematically interviewing church members, offering financial incentives for information that quickly exceeded what the Westbrooks could counter. This external pressure coincided with growing internal fractures within the Westbrook organization. Their decades of success had bred arrogance and carelessness. Isaiah's sermons had become increasingly apocalyptic, promising divine retribution against enemies of the faith, thinly veiled threats against anyone who questioned their authority. Daniel had developed a laudanum dependency that affected his reliability, occasionally making contradictory theological pronouncements that confused followers. Samuel, always the most pragmatic brother, had begun transferring assets to accounts in New Orleans, possibly planning an exit strategy. These vulnerabilities created an opening for Jacob Miller, a deacon in the Columbus Church who had served the Westbrooks faithfully for nearly 20 years. Miller had recently lost his daughter and grandchildren in the Illinois settlement's first summer, victims of what church records dispassionately classified as marsh fever. His grief turned to rage when he accidentally discovered documents suggesting the Westbrooks had specific knowledge of the settlement's deadly conditions before sending settlers there. The tipping point came when Miller overheard Samuel discussing Martha Collins' permanent silence with another church elder. The conversation, which took place in what they thought was an empty church office, included references to handling the situation the same way we handled the Peterson woman in 29, an apparent reference to another disappearance that had never been properly investigated. In September of 1838, Miller made contact with William Collins, providing insider confirmation of Martha's discoveries. More importantly, he revealed the existence of the brothers' most closely guarded secret, a master ledger containing records of all deaths, property transfers, and profits from each settlement since 1805. This ledger, which the brothers referred to as the accounting, was supposedly kept in a hidden compartment beneath the pulpit of the original Millfield Church, which now served primarily as a historical shrine for the movement. They call it the accounting, but not in the sense of financial records alone. Miller told Collins in a sworn statement, "It's their understanding of a divine accounting, a record they believe justifies their actions. Isaiah has convinced himself that these deaths serve a greater purpose. Daniel has constructed elaborate theological justifications. But Samuel, he sees only the profits. He keeps that ledger as a businessman keeps a record of successful transactions." Armed with this information, Collins approached Ohio Governor Wilson Shannon, who authorized a discreet investigation to avoid tipping off the Westbrooks. State authorities planned a coordinated seizure of documents from multiple church locations for December of 1838. But their operation was compromised by a church sympathizer working in the governor's office. Warned of the impending investigation, the Westbrooks initiated what church members were told was a purification ritual. In reality, it was a massive destruction of incriminating evidence. Fires burned for 3 days at church properties throughout Ohio, with Samuel personally overseeing the removal of financial records from their Cincinnati headquarters. Witnesses reported seeing wagons loaded with document boxes departing for unknown destinations under armed guard. The most dramatic confrontation occurred at the Millfield Church, where Isaiah himself arrived with several loyal followers to retrieve the accounting. They were interrupted by local Sheriff Thomas Redfield, who had received an anonymous tip, later revealed to be from Jacob Miller. The ensuing confrontation left 2 church members dead and Isaiah wounded, but the Westbrooks escaped with most of their critical documentation. This episode launched what newspapers of the day called the Westbrook Exodus. Over the next 3 months, the brothers liquidated what assets they could and fled south toward New Orleans with approximately 60 loyal followers. Their journey was tracked through Kentucky and Tennessee by a combination of private detectives hired by Collins and federal marshals, responding to formal charges of fraud and conspiracy filed in Ohio courts. The investigation expanded as they fled, with authorities in multiple states discovering additional evidence of the brothers' crimes. In a Nashville hotel room abandoned by Daniel, investigators found partial records suggesting the brothers had begun exploring similar schemes in Texas and even Central America, with notes about settlement opportunities in regions known for yellow fever and other tropical diseases. The brothers' final days remain shrouded in conflicting accounts. The most widely accepted version, based on court testimonies from former followers who later surrendered to authorities, places all 3 Westbrooks on a steamboat bound for New Orleans in February of 1839. According to these accounts, as federal authorities closed in, Samuel betrayed his brothers, escaping with most of their remaining fortune during a stop in Natchez, Mississippi. Sarah Holloway, one of the loyal followers who accompanied the brothers on their flight south, later provided testimony that offered rare insight into the brothers' deteriorating relationship. By Natchez, they were hardly speaking. Isaiah spent his days in prayer, convinced that divine intervention would yet save them. Daniel was barely coherent most days, lost in laudanum dreams. Samuel watched them both with growing contempt. The night before we reached Natchez, I overheard him tell Isaiah, "Your God has abandoned us, brother. It's time I look to my own salvation." Isaiah and Daniel, now fugitives with dwindling resources, reportedly continued to New Orleans, where they attempted to secure passage to Cuba. On the night of March 12, 1839, both brothers were killed in what local police recorded as a merchant dispute turned violent at the New Orleans waterfront. Some historians suggest this convenient end to the manhunt might actually represent an extrajudicial killing sanctioned by authorities who feared the brothers' trial would create embarrassing revelations about how they had operated with impunity for so long. A dock worker who witnessed the incident later claimed that Isaiah died clutching a small leather-bound book to his chest, potentially a portion of the accounting that had not been recovered. His final words reportedly were not prayers, but a defiant claim. "Our work is recorded in heaven. You cannot erase what we have built." Samuel Westbrook's fate remains the most mysterious. Various reports placed him in Cuba, Mexico, and even England in the years following his brothers' deaths. The most credible account comes from Brazilian police records, which document the 1847 arrest of an American calling himself Samuel West for operating a fraudulent religious colony near São Paulo. The description matches Samuel Westbrook, and the scheme bore remarkable similarities to the Ohio operations. This suspect died in custody before trial, reportedly from self-administered poison. A journal confiscated from Samuel West by Brazilian authorities contained passages that seemed to confirm his identity. My brothers lacked vision. They saw our work as confined to the American frontier. I always understood that our model could function anywhere faith blinds people to reason. The principles remain sound, though implementation must adapt to local conditions. What's most disturbing about the Westbrooks isn't just the scale of their crimes, estimated to have caused between 7,000 and 9,000 deaths over 3 decades, but how effectively they exploited America's religious landscape to commit them. They operated during a period of intense spiritual experimentation, when new denominations and religious movements emerged regularly across the frontier. Their settlements were isolated enough to avoid scrutiny, but close enough to transportation networks to attract new victims. They exploited fundamental weaknesses in America's developing society: the lack of communication between scattered communities, the absence of regulatory oversight on the frontier, and, most critically, the constitutional protections for religious practice that made authorities reluctant to investigate even suspicious church activities. Their operation represented a perfect storm of religious manipulation, geographical isolation, and financial exploitation that allowed mass casualties to accumulate for decades without intervention. The Westbrooks understood something fundamental about America during this period, wrote historian James Thornton in his landmark analysis, Faith and Fraud on the Frontier. Religious freedom, one of our nation's greatest virtues, created space for both genuine spiritual innovation and deadly exploitation. The frontier's distance from established authority structures made it impossible to distinguish dangerous cults from sincere new denominations until it was often too late. In this regulatory vacuum, the brothers constructed what may be the most profitable murder scheme in American history. The brothers' operation worked not just because of their cunning, but because it exploited deep psychological vulnerabilities. Dr. Eleanor Matthews, a historian specializing in 19th century religious movements, explains, the Westbrooks offered what every frontier settler desperately needed: community, purpose, and divine reassurance in a chaotic and dangerous environment. By framing their settlements as divinely chosen locations, they transformed ordinary land speculation into a sacred calling. Questioning the promised land wasn't just expressing doubt about real estate. It was challenging God's will itself. What made their manipulation particularly effective was how they integrated it with legitimate religious practices. Sunday services in Westbrook churches followed recognizable Protestant formats. Their hymns were standard Methodist and Baptist compositions. Their basic theological tenets, salvation through faith, the importance of community, preparation for Christ's return, aligned with mainstream Christianity. This veneer of normalcy made the dangerous innovations harder to detect. Few people realized that what made the Westbrook scheme so effective was their deep understanding of both theology and human psychology. In a time when religious identity was central to most Americans' lives, they crafted a narrative that made questioning their authority equivalent to questioning God Himself. This channel is exclusively for those who seek the unvarnished truth about America's darkest chapters. If you've stayed with us this far, you're clearly someone who values historical honesty over comfortable myths. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell if you haven't already, and share this video with others who appreciate these hidden histories. The aftermath of the Westbrook conspiracy reverberated through American society for decades. In Ohio, the scandal prompted the first state laws regulating religious land holdings and requiring financial transparency from churches. The Westbrook Regulations, as they came to be known, established precedents for distinguishing between religious freedom and fraudulent exploitation that influenced legislation in multiple states. Several promised land settlements were eventually reclaimed by survivors and their descendants, though many remained abandoned, grim monuments to a tragedy too painful to reclaim. The sites themselves became the subject of local legends and superstitions. The original Logan settlement, where the first victims died, remained uninhabited for nearly 50 years after the Westbrooks' exposure. Local residents reported unusual phenomena around the abandoned cabins, though these stories likely reflected the psychological impact of knowing what had occurred there rather than any supernatural presence. When the land was finally redeveloped in the 1890s, workers reportedly refused to dig foundations near the old settlement cemetery. The most complete accounting of the Westbrooks' victims came through the persistent efforts of William Collins, who continued investigating long after the brothers' deaths. Working with Jacob Miller and other former church members, Collins established the Westbrook Victims Registry, which documented 8,432 deaths directly attributable to the brothers' settlements. This registry, maintained at the Ohio Historical Society until 1915, provided the basis for limited restitution payments to survivors authorized by the Ohio legislature in 1845. Collins dedicated the remainder of his life to this cause, spending his considerable fortune tracking down survivors and documenting the brothers' crimes. His work expanded beyond mere accounting into one of America's first systematic studies of religious exploitation. This was never about just one family's crimes. He wrote in 1850, "The Westbrooks exposed vulnerabilities in how we balance religious freedom with public safety, questions we as a nation must address if similar tragedies are to be prevented." Emma Collins, Martha's cousin who had unwittingly facilitated her investigation, suffered profound guilt after learning the truth about the church she had joined. She became a key witness in the state investigations, providing crucial testimony about the brothers' operations despite threats from remaining church loyalists. After the investigations concluded, she established a shelter in Columbus for women who had escaped exploitative religious communities, one of the first such institutions in America. While the physical evidence of the Westbrook conspiracy has largely vanished, their churches demolished, their records destroyed, their settlements reclaimed by nature, certain artifacts periodically resurface. In 1890, a farmer near the site of the original Logan settlement discovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 40 individuals, including 27 children, all showing signs of death by disease. The grave configuration suggested hasty burial during an epidemic, consistent with Elizabeth Winter's diary descriptions. In 1923, renovations to an old Columbus building revealed a hidden cache of Westbrook church documents, including partial settlement maps and property transfer records. These papers, now preserved in the Ohio State Archives, provided new insights into the brothers' methodology, including coded language used to disguise their true intentions in official correspondence. Most recently, in 1998, an antique desk purchased at an estate auction in Cincinnati was found to contain a false bottom concealing what appears to be Samuel Westbrook's personal journal from 1830 to 1832. The journal, currently undergoing authentication at the Smithsonian Institution, contains entries that suggest the brothers may have attempted to expand their operations into adjacent criminal enterprises, including insurance fraud and identity theft, concepts remarkably sophisticated for their era. Archaeological excavations conducted at several settlement sites in the 1970s revealed physical evidence supporting survivors' accounts. At the fifth settlement location near present-day Springfield, Ohio, researchers discovered the foundations of cabins built in flood-prone locations, despite nearby higher ground being available, confirming deliberate placement in hazardous conditions. Analysis of soil samples from several sites confirmed historical accounts of conditions unsuitable for agriculture or long-term habitation. Perhaps most disturbing is the enduring influence of the Westbrooks' theological framework. Elements of their teachings, particularly their concept of chosen settlements and covenants of faith, have appeared in multiple religious movements throughout American history, suggesting their materials circulated long after their deaths. As recently as the 1980s, authorities in Montana dismantled a religious community whose founding documents contained passages identical to the Westbrooks' covenant texts. Though no direct lineage could be established, religious scholars have identified what they term Westbrook patterns in various exploitative movements: charismatic leadership claiming divine authority, isolation of followers in remote locations, and financial arrangements that transfer assets to the organization. The Westbrooks didn't invent religious exploitation, notes theologian Dr. Robert Harmon, but they refined it into a terrifyingly efficient system that has unfortunately inspired others. Martha Collins, whose brave investigation triggered the Westbrooks' downfall, was officially declared dead in 1845 after exhaustive searches failed to find any trace of her. Her father established a foundation in her name dedicated to investigating religious fraud, which operated throughout the latter half of the 19th century. The Martha Collins Society funded investigations into suspicious religious movements and provided legal assistance to those seeking to leave controlling groups, work that continues through successor organizations today. In 1890, a woman in San Francisco claiming to be Martha briefly captured public attention, but investigations prove she was an imposter seeking financial gain from the Collins family. The true fate of Martha Collins remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the Westbrook case, with theories ranging from murder at the hands of Samuel Westbrook to a new identity established in another country. What happened to Martha Collins represents the Westbrooks' final secret, wrote Elizabeth Chambers in her 2005 analysis of the case. The brothers took that knowledge to their graves, leaving us with questions that may never be answered. Periodic claims of Martha Collins sightings continued well into the 20th century, becoming a kind of American folklore. In the 1920s, an elderly woman in a Paris boarding house reportedly told stories of the Westbrook brothers to fellow residents before disappearing when American visitors expressed interest in her account. In 1943, a donation to the Ohio Historical Society included a locket containing what appeared to be a later-life portrait of a woman resembling Martha, though its provenance could not be verified. The final known reference to the accounting, the master ledger documenting the brothers' operations, appears in a letter from a New Orleans antiquities dealer to a collector in Boston dated 1879. The letter describes a most curious volume containing records of religious settlements and their tragic fates, bound in red leather with unusual brass fittings. The dealer reported purchasing it from the estate of a deceased sailor who claimed to have acquired it from the effects of a religious man who met his end on the docks many years ago. The letter indicated the book had been sold to an unnamed European collector, and its location remains unknown. Some evidence suggests elements of the Westbrook organization survived the brothers' downfall. Court records from throughout the Midwest document legal proceedings against individuals identified as former church officials who attempted to establish similar operations on a smaller scale. As late as 1870, authorities in Nebraska dismantled a settlement that bore striking similarities to the Westbrook model, led by a man who had served as a deacon in their Columbus church. The Westbrook conspiracy shows us how easily religious devotion can be weaponized when combined with greed and charisma. Their story serves as a warning about the dangers of unquestioning faith and the vulnerability of those seeking spiritual meaning. In America's religious landscape, where freedom of belief is foundational, but oversight is often limited, the line between sincere spiritual innovation and deadly exploitation remains dangerously thin. What do you think of this dark chapter in American history? Do you believe everything about the Westbrooks has been revealed, or are there still secrets buried in America's religious past? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this exploration of America's hidden horrors, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates historical mysteries. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face our nation's darkest truths. See you in the next video.